The woman on the auction block had eyes like a winter sky, pale and empty. And when Yates Sullivan first saw her standing there in the dusty square of Virginia City, Nevada, something in his chest cracked open like an egg. It was September of 1876, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the crowd that had gathered in front of the old courthouse. Yates had come into town for supplies, nothing more, but the commotion in the square had drawn him like moths to a flame. He pushed through the throng of unwashed bodies, whiskey-soaked breath, and tobacco-stained teeth until he could see what all the fuss was about. She stood on a wooden platform, her dress torn at the shoulder, her auburn hair matted and dull. But it was not her appearance that stopped Yates in his tracks. It was the absolute deadness in her gaze, as if whoever she had been before had been carved out and discarded, leaving only a hollow shell behind. "What the hell is this?" Yates muttered to the man beside him, a grizzled prospector with more beard than face. "Debt auction," the prospector said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Woman's husband died owing money all over town. Creditors are selling her contract to the highest bidder. 3 years of labor to pay off what he owed." Yates felt his jaw tighten. He had heard of such things, though they made his stomach turn. In the wild territories, laws were still being written, and desperate men made desperate rules. A woman alone with debts she could not pay had few options. The territorial courts allowed such contracts, though they called it indentured servitude rather than what it truly was. The auctioneer, a fat man with a face like a boiled ham, was calling out numbers. "Do I hear $200 for 3 years of labor? This here is a strong woman, good with cooking and cleaning, I am told." Men in the crowd shouted their bids, their eyes roving over the woman's figure with an appetite that made Yates want to put his fist through something. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond the town, beyond everything. "250. Someone shouted. "300, called another. Yates found himself stepping forward before he had fully decided to do so. $500, he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The crowd fell silent. $500 was more than twice what anyone else had bid. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. 500. "Do I hear 550? No one spoke. $500 was a fortune, more than most men in Virginia City saw in a year. The auctioneer waited, then brought his gavel down with a crack that echoed off the false-fronted buildings. "Sold, to the gentleman in the brown hat." Yates moved through the crowd, ignoring the stares and muttered comments. He climbed the steps to the platform where the woman stood and found himself looking into those empty eyes up close. She was younger than he had thought, perhaps 23 or 24, though hardship had etched lines around her mouth and eyes that made her seem older. "I am Yates Sullivan," he said quietly. "I have a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. I could use help with cooking and general housekeeping. The work is honest, and I will treat you fairly." She looked at him without speaking, without any flicker of emotion crossing her face. Up close, he could see a bruise fading to yellow on her cheekbone, and his anger at whatever had brought her to this point flared hot in his chest. The auctioneer thrust a sheaf of papers at him. "Sign here, here, and here. The contract states 3 years of labor in exchange for the settlement of debts totaling $412, plus court fees. She is your responsibility now. If she runs, you are liable for the full amount." Yates signed without reading, which was foolish, but he wanted to get the woman away from the leering crowd as quickly as possible. He counted out $500 in gold coins and banknotes, watching his savings disappear with each bill he handed over. "What is your name?" he asked the woman as he helped her down from the platform. She moved like a sleepwalker, her hand cold in his. "Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace Harper." They walked through the town toward where Yates had left his wagon and horses. People stared as they passed, and Yates kept his hand near the revolver at his hip, though he hoped he would not need it. Grace walked beside him in silence, her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The wagon was loaded with supplies from the general store, sacks of flour and sugar, coffee and dried beans. Yates helped Grace onto the bench seat, noting how she flinched when his hand touched her elbow. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking his tongue to get the horses moving. They rode out of Virginia City in silence, the sounds of the town fading behind them as they headed into the sagebrush country that stretched toward the mountains. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful country, harsh and unforgiving but beautiful nonetheless, and Yates had carved out a life here that he was proud of. "I should tell you about the ranch," he said after they had been riding for a while. "It is not fancy, but it is mine. I have about 200 head of cattle, some horses, and a decent piece of land with good water. The house is small, just 3 rooms, but it is solid. I built it myself 4 years ago when I first claimed the land." Grace said nothing. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. Yates tried again. "I do not expect anything from you that is not in the contract. You will have your own room, such as it is. I sleep in the main room by the stove in winter and out on the porch in summer. You will cook and clean and help with the garden. That is all. I am not the kind of man who would force himself on a woman if that is what you are worried about." Still no response. He sighed and gave up, focusing on the road ahead. The horses knew the way home and needed little guidance. The sun sank lower, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. By the time they reached the ranch, full night had fallen. The house sat in a small valley with a creek running through it, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a stand of cottonwoods. Yates pulled the wagon up to the front porch and set the brake. "We are here," he said unnecessarily. He helped Grace down and led her inside, lighting a kerosene lamp that filled the room with warm, flickering light. The house was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace at one end, a cook stove, a table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with books and supplies. A door on the left led to what Yates had intended to be a bedroom but had never bothered to furnish properly. "This will be your room," he said, pushing the door open. There was a bed with a straw mattress, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "I know it is not much, but the mattress is clean, and I have extra blankets if you need them." Grace walked into the room and stood in the center, looking around as if she could not quite believe what she was seeing. "Are you hungry?" Yates asked. "I have some bread and cold beef from yesterday, or I could make coffee if you prefer." She turned to look at him, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or suspicion. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you pay so much for me?" Yates rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly uncomfortable. "Because what they were doing was wrong. Because you looked like you needed help. Because I could. Men do not help women for nothing. They always want something." Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, and it broke Yates's heart a little to hear such cynicism from someone so young. "I suppose that is true often enough," he said. "But I give you my word, Grace Harper, that I will not ask anything of you beyond honest work. You can bolt your door at night if it makes you feel safer. In 3 years, your debt will be paid and you will be free to go wherever you want. Until then, I will do my best to make sure you are treated with respect and decency." She studied him for a long moment, those pale eyes searching his face for signs of deception. Finally, she nodded once, a tiny dip of her chin. "I am very tired," she said. "Of course. I will leave you to rest. The outhouse is around back, and there is a basin and pitcher for washing. Sleep as long as you need." Yates closed the door behind him and stood in the main room, listening to the sounds of Grace moving around in the bedroom. He had acted on impulse in town, driven by anger and pity, but now he had to figure out what came next. He had a broken woman living in his house, bound to him by a contract that felt more like a chain, and he had no idea how to help her heal. He made himself a simple supper of bread and cheese, then bedded down on the cot by the stove. Sleep was a long time coming. He kept thinking about the emptiness in Grace's eyes and wondering what kind of hell she had been through to put it there. The next morning, Yates woke before dawn, as was his habit. He dressed quietly and went outside to tend to the animals, feeding the horses and checking on the cattle in the near pasture. The air was crisp and cool, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. It was his favorite time of day, peaceful and full of promise. When he came back to the house, he found Grace in the kitchen, building up the fire in the stove. She had changed into a different dress, still worn but cleaner than the one she had worn yesterday, and had attempted to tame her hair into a braid. "Good morning," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Good morning," she replied without looking at him. "What would you like for breakfast?" "Whatever is easy. I usually just have coffee and some bread with butter. But if you are hungry, there are eggs in the crate on the porch and bacon hanging in the smokehouse out back." She nodded and set about making coffee, her movements efficient despite her obvious exhaustion. Yates watched her for a moment, then decided to give her space and went to sit at the table with the newspaper he had picked up in town the day before. They ate in silence, Grace nibbling at a piece of bread while Yates worked his way through eggs and bacon. The coffee was strong and good, better than he usually managed to make himself. "This is fine coffee," he said, attempting conversation. "Thank you. You are welcome." More silence. Yates cleared his throat. "I thought I might ride out to check on the south fence line today. There was some damage from that storm last week. You are welcome to come along if you want to see the property, or you can stay here and rest. There is no hurry to start working." "I should stay and clean the house," Grace said. "It is what you are paying me for." "Grace, I am not paying you. I paid off a debt that was not yours to begin with. There is a difference." She finally looked at him, and he saw a flash of anger in her eyes, the first real emotion he had seen from her. "There is no difference. I am here because I have no choice. You own my labor for 3 years. That makes me no better than a slave." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and true. "No," Yates said firmly. "You are not a slave. A slave cannot leave. You can walk out that door right now if you want. I would not stop you. And where would I go? I have no money, no family, no one who would take me in. And you would still be out $500, which means you would have every right to come after me with the law on your side." She was right, and they both knew it. The territorial laws were on his side if she ran. She was bound to him as surely as if he had put her in chains. "Then let us make the best of it," Yates said quietly. "I will treat you fairly, and you will do whatever work you feel comfortable with. If you want to leave before the 3 years are up, we can discuss it. I am not your enemy, Grace." She looked away, her jaw tight. "I will clean the house," she repeated. Yates sighed and stood, collecting his dishes and taking them to the basin. "All right, I will be back by midday. If you need anything, the rifle is over the door and there is ammunition in the drawer of the table. I have never had trouble with anyone coming around, but it is good to be prepared." He left her in the kitchen and headed out to saddle his horse, a bay gelding named Red who had been with him since his first year on the ranch. As he rode toward the south pasture, he could not stop thinking about the conversation at breakfast. Grace was right that the situation was fundamentally unjust, but he had not created the system that had put her in that position. He had only tried to save her from something worse. The question was whether his intentions mattered if the result was the same. He spent the morning repairing fence posts and restringing wire, hard physical labor that usually helped clear his mind. Today, it did not work. He kept seeing Grace's face, the deadness in her eyes, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly. When he returned to the house at midday, he found it transformed. The floors had been swept and scrubbed, the windows cleaned until they sparkled, and the dishes were all washed and put away. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and there was a pot of stew simmering on the stove. Grace was sitting at the table, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. "Good Lord," Yates said, looking around in amazement. "You have been busy." "It is what you are paying me for," she said again, but there was less edge in her voice this time. "Well, it looks wonderful, thank you, and something smells delicious. Stew, it will be ready in another hour." Yates washed up at the basin and sat down across from her. "Grace, I want you to understand something. I am not going to hover over you or watch your every move. You are not a prisoner here. If you want to go for walks or ride one of the horses or just sit and do nothing, that is fine. You do not have to work yourself to exhaustion to justify your existence." She looked at him with those pale, empty eyes. "What else would I do?" The question was so sad, so devoid of hope or imagination that Yates had to look away. He realized then just how thoroughly broken Grace Harper was, how completely her spirit had been crushed. "Whatever you want," he said gently. "Read a book, learn to play the guitar, watch the clouds, whatever brings you even a small bit of peace." She did not respond, and after a moment she stood and went to tend to the stew. Yates watched her move around the kitchen, this stranger in his home, and wondered how long it would take for her to believe that she was safe here. The days settled into a routine. Yates woke early and tended to the ranch work, while Grace kept the house spotless and prepared meals that were far better than anything he had eaten in years. She spoke little and never smiled, moving through her tasks with mechanical efficiency. At night, she retreated to her room and bolted the door, and Yates did not blame her one bit. He tried to give her space while also making it clear that he was available if she needed anything. He left books on the table for her to read, taught her how to shoot the rifle in case of emergencies, and showed her the best places to find wild herbs and greens near the creek. She accepted these offerings with polite nods, but never showed any real interest or enthusiasm. 2 weeks after bringing her home, Yates came in from the morning chores to find Grace standing at the window, staring out at the mountains. There was something different about her posture, a slight relaxation in her shoulders that had not been there before. "They are beautiful, are they not?" he said, coming to stand beside her. "I never get tired of looking at them." "My husband hated the mountains," Grace said quietly. It was the first time she had mentioned her husband since coming to the ranch. "He said they made him feel trapped. He wanted to go to California, but we never had the money." Yates waited, sensing that she might say more if he did not push. "He was not a bad man," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just weak. He gambled and drank and made promises he could not keep. And when he died, he left me with nothing but debts and shame." "How did he die?" Yates asked gently. "He was shot in a card game. Someone accused him of cheating, and he was not fast enough on the draw." She laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "The funny thing is, he probably was cheating. He always did when he thought he could get away with it." "I am sorry, Grace." She turned to look at him, and for the first time there was something like curiosity in her eyes. "Why? You did not know him, and from what I have told you, he does not sound like someone worth mourning. I am sorry that you had to go through that you had to stand on that auction block and be sold like a piece of property. That is what I am sorry for." She studied him for a long moment. "You are a strange man, Yates Sullivan. So I have been told. Most men would have taken advantage of the situation. Most men would have thought they bought more than just my labor." Yates felt his face heat. "I am not most men." "No," she agreed. "You are not." It was a small moment, hardly worth noting, but Yates felt as if something had shifted between them. A tiny crack in the wall Grace had built around herself. That afternoon, he saddled 2 horses and asked if she would like to ride out with him to check on the cattle. To his surprise, she agreed. They rode in companionable silence, Grace handling her horse with the ease of someone who had grown up around animals. The day was clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue overhead, and the cattle were fat and content in the autumn grass. "This is good land," Grace said, looking around. "You have done well for yourself." "It was not easy," Yates admitted. "I came out here with nothing but a wagon, some tools, and more stubbornness than sense. The first winter I nearly froze to death, and the second year I lost half my herd to rustlers. But I survived, and each year has been a little better than the last." "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri. My family had a farm outside of Independence. When my parents died of cholera in '73, I sold the place and headed west. I had always wanted to see the mountains." "Do you ever regret it, leaving everything behind?" Yates considered the question. "Sometimes I miss my parents and my old life. But no, I do not regret coming here. This is where I am supposed to be. I feel it in my bones." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have never felt like I belonged anywhere. Even before my husband died, I always felt like I was just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Maybe that can change. Maybe this place can be a fresh start for you." She gave him a sad smile. "Maybe. But 3 years from now I will still have to leave." "Not if you do not want to," Yates said before he could stop himself. "I mean, if you wanted to stay after your contract is up, you would be welcome, as a hired hand with fair wages, or just as a friend, whatever you wanted." Grace looked at him with an expression he could not read. "Let us not think that far ahead," she said finally. "I can barely manage to think past tomorrow." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. More comfortable, less weighted with fear and suspicion. As October arrived and the weather began to turn colder, Yates noticed more small changes in Grace. She still did not smile, but the lines around her mouth had softened slightly. She began to ask questions about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, about his plans for the future. She started to eat a little more at meals, and the hollow look in her cheeks began to fill out. One evening, Yates came in from fixing a gate to find her sitting at the table with one of his books open in front of her. It was a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, one of his favorites. "You like it?" he asked, hanging up his coat. "It is strange," she said, "but beautiful. Listen to this. I am large, I contain multitudes. What do you think that means?" Yates sat down across from her. "I think it means that people are complicated, that we can hold many different feelings and thoughts at the same time, even ones that seem to contradict each other. We are not just one thing." Grace traced her finger along the words on the page. "I used to write poetry," she said quietly. "A long time ago, before I was married. My mother said it was foolish, that I should focus on practical skills like sewing and cooking. But I loved putting words together, trying to capture something true." "You still remember any of it?" She shook her head. "I burned all my notebooks when I got married. My husband said poetry was a waste of time." "That was his loss," Yates said firmly, "and yours, but it is not too late. You could start writing again." I would not know what to write about. Write about the mountains. Write about the sky. Write about whatever you are feeling. The point is not to be good at it, just to do it because it brings you joy." Grace closed the book carefully, running her hand over the cover. "I do not remember what joy feels like." The admission was so honest, so raw, that Yates felt it like a physical blow. He reached across the table, then stopped, remembering how she flinched from touch. Instead, he just said, "Then maybe we can work on helping you remember." She looked up at him, and something passed between them, some wordless understanding. For just a moment, Yates saw past the brokenness to the woman she might have been, might still be, if given the chance to heal. That night, for the first time since coming to the ranch, Grace did not bolt her door. The next morning, Yates found a piece of paper on the table, carefully folded in half. When he opened it, he saw a few lines of verse written in neat, flowing handwriting. "The mountains stand eternal witness to my small life. Perhaps I too can be unmoved, can survive the storm and strife." It was not great poetry, but it was honest, and it was hers. Yates felt something warm bloom in his chest as he read it. He left the paper where he had found it and went about his day, but he kept thinking about those words, about what they revealed about Grace's state of mind. That evening, she asked if he thought the poem was any good. He told her the truth, that it was a beginning, and beginnings were precious things. As the weeks passed, they fell into an easy partnership. Grace continued to keep the house and cook, but she also began to help with some of the lighter ranch work. She fed the chickens Yates bought from a neighbor, gathered eggs, and helped him harvest vegetables from the garden before the first frost. She seemed to take comfort in the physical labor, in the simple satisfaction of tasks completed. They talked more, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Yates learned that Grace had grown up in Ohio, the youngest of 5 children, and that her father had been a Methodist preacher with strict ideas about proper behavior. She had married at 18 to escape his household, only to find that her husband was just as controlling in his own way. She had spent 6 years trying to be the woman everyone else wanted her to be, until there was almost nothing left of her real self. Yates told her about his own struggles, about the loneliness of building a life alone in wild country, about the dreams he had for expanding the ranch someday. He found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, thoughts and feelings he usually kept locked away. One cold afternoon in November, they were repairing a section of the barn roof when a storm rolled in faster than expected. The wind picked up, bringing stinging rain that quickly turned to sleet. They scrambled down the ladder and ran for the house, arriving soaked and shivering. "Get out of those wet clothes," Yates said, his teeth chattering. "I will build up the fire." Grace disappeared into her room while Yates stripped off his wet shirt and hung it near the stove. He was struggling to get the fire going with damp kindling when Grace emerged, wrapped in a blanket, her hair hanging in wet ropes around her shoulders. "Here, let me," she said, kneeling beside him. Her fingers were nimble and quick, arranging the kindling and newspaper in a way that caught immediately. Soon, flames were crackling cheerfully, throwing warmth into the room. They sat side by side on the floor in front of the fire, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage outside. It was comfortable and companionable, and Yates was acutely aware of Grace's shoulder almost touching his. "I have been thinking," Grace said after a while, "about what happens when the 3 years are up." Yates's heart clenched. "What about it? I would like to stay, if the offer is still open. Not as an indentured servant, but as you said, as a hired hand. Or a partner, maybe, if you would be willing to teach me more about running a ranch. Grace, you can stay as long as you want. Forever, if that suits you. And yes, I would be happy to teach you everything I know." She turned to look at him, and he was struck by how much her face had changed in the 2 months since he had brought her home. There was color in her cheeks, light in her eyes, life returning to her features. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked. "What do you get out of it?" Yates considered his answer carefully. The truth was that he had developed feelings for Grace, feelings that went beyond compassion or friendship, but he was afraid that saying so would break the fragile trust they had built. "I get the pleasure of your company," he said carefully. "And the satisfaction of seeing you heal, that is enough for me." Grace studied his face for a long moment. "I think you are lying," she said softly, "but I appreciate it anyway." Before Yates could respond, she leaned forward and kissed him, light as a butterfly landing on a flower. It was over in a heartbeat, and then she was pulling back, her eyes wide with surprise at her own boldness. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I should not have done that." "No," Yates said, his heart pounding. Yes, you do not need to apologize. I just do not want you to feel obligated. I do not want you to think that you owe me anything." "What if it is not about obligation?" Grace asked. "What if I wanted to?" Yates reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. "Then I would be the happiest man in Nevada." She smiled, a real genuine smile, the first he had seen from her, and it transformed her completely. She looked young and beautiful and full of possibility. "I am not ready for everything," she said quietly. "I have too much hurt still to work through. But I think I could be someday, if you are willing to wait." "I will wait as long as you need," Yates promised. "There is no rush. We have all the time in the world." They sat together by the fire as the storm raged outside, and Yates felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Hope that Grace would continue to heal. Hope that they could build something real together. Hope that the future held more than just survival, but actual happiness. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Yates's life. Grace continued to blossom like a flower finally given water and sunlight. She laughed more, talked more, and engaged with the world around her in ways she had not before. They worked together during the day and spent the evenings reading, talking, or playing cards. Yates taught her to play chess, and she proved to be a quick study, beating him within a month. They kissed sometimes, sweet, gentle kisses that asked for nothing more than they could give. Yates was patient, letting Grace set the pace, and he was rewarded with her growing trust and affection. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing snow that blanketed the valley in white. They spent days snowed in together, and rather than feeling trapped, Yates found he relished the enforced closeness. Grace seemed to feel the same way. She would sit by his side as he read aloud from books, her head resting on his shoulder, and Yates would think that he had never been happier. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Grace said, "Tell me about your dreams for this place. What do you want it to become?" Yates set down the wood he had been whittling and considered the question. "I would like to expand the herd, eventually have 500 head of cattle or more, maybe get into breeding horses as well. I would like to build a bigger house, something with a proper bedroom and a parlor. And I would like to have a family someday if that is in the cards for me." "Children?" Grace asked. "Someday. If I found the right woman to build a life with, someone strong and smart and not afraid of hard work, someone who could be a true partner." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I always wanted children," she said softly, "but my husband did not. He said we could not afford them, but really I think he just did not want the responsibility, and after a while I stopped wanting them too. I stopped wanting anything." "And now?" Yates asked gently. "Now I am starting to want things again, and it terrifies me." Yates reached for her hand and she let him take it. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I am afraid it will all be taken away again. Every time I have ever wanted something, it has been ripped from my hands." Why should this be any different? Because you are different now, Yates said firmly. You are stronger than you were, and because I am not going anywhere, I will be right here, building this life with you for as long as you want me. Grace looked at him with tears shining in her eyes. I am falling in love with you, she whispered, and I do not know what to do about it. Yates felt his breath catch. I have been in love with you for months, he admitted. Since that day you left me the poem, maybe even before that. How can you love someone as broken as me? You are not broken, Grace. You were hurt, but you are healing. And even at your worst, I saw the strength in you, the courage it took just to keep breathing when everything had been taken from you. How could I not love you? The tears spilled over, running down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. I do not deserve you. That is nonsense. I am the lucky one here. Now come here. She moved into his arms, and they held each other by the fire, the wind howling outside but the house warm and safe. Yates stroked her hair and murmured promises into the crown of her head, promises that he intended to keep. Christmas came, and Yates made Grace a gift of a leather-bound journal and a good pen. She cried when she opened it, then spent the rest of the day filling the first pages with poetry and thoughts. For him, she had knitted a scarf from wool she had bought with the small allowance he insisted on giving her each week. It was slightly crooked and had a few dropped stitches, but Yates declared it the finest scarf in the entire territory and wore it constantly. As the new year of 1877 arrived, they made plans for the future. Grace wanted to learn more about handling cattle and horses, and Yates began teaching her in earnest. She proved to be a natural, fearless in the saddle and quick to understand the needs of the animals. By February, she could rope a calf as well as Yates could, and she was better than him at spotting signs of illness or injury in the herd. They also began to talk more seriously about their relationship. Grace was clear that she needed more time before she would be ready for marriage, and Yates respected that. But they were partners in every way that mattered, working side by side to build something that belonged to both of them. In March, a man named Thomas Garrett showed up at the ranch, claiming to be a creditor who had not been paid his share when Grace's debts were settled. He was a hard-eyed man with a cruel mouth, and he demanded that Grace come back to Virginia City to work off what he said she owed him. Yates met him on the porch with his rifle across his arm. The debt was paid in full. I have the paperwork to prove it. Grace Harper is under contract to me for 3 years, and that contract has been filed with the territorial court. You have no claim on her. Garrett spat into the dirt. $500 did not cover everything. She still owes me $200. Then you should have made your claim before the auction. Now get off my land before I shoot you for trespassing. Garrett glared at him, but must have seen something in Yates's eyes that convinced him not to push further. He mounted his horse and rode away, but not before calling back. This is not over. I will be back with the law. Grace had been watching from the window, and when Yates came inside, she was pale and shaking. He will not give up. Men like him never do. Then we will deal with it, Yates said firmly. Tomorrow I will ride into Virginia City and talk to the territorial judge. We will make sure everything is legal and binding. No one is taking you away from here, Grace. I promise you that. The next day, Yates made the trip to town and spent several hours with Judge Harrison, going over all the paperwork related to Grace's debt. The judge confirmed that the debt had been settled in full, and that Garrett had no legal claim. He also drew up additional papers that made it clear Grace was under contract to Yates, and that any attempt to interfere with that contract would be prosecuted. Armed with these documents, Yates returned to the ranch feeling more secure. When he told Grace what the judge had said, she cried with relief. "Thank you," she said, clinging to him. "Thank you for fighting for me. No one has ever done that before." "I will always fight for you," Yates promised. Always. Garrett did come back one more time, this time with a sheriff's deputy. But when confronted with the legal documents and the judge's clear ruling, he had no choice but to back down. Yates watched him ride away and felt a deep satisfaction. Grace was safe, and she was his, at least for now. Spring arrived in an explosion of wildflowers and green grass. The cattle grew fat, and 2 of the mares had foals that Grace doted on like they were her children. She was laughing now, often and easily, and the transformation from the hollow-eyed woman on the auction block to the vibrant person she had become was nothing short of miraculous. One warm afternoon in May, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Grace said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" Yates asked, tilting his hat back to look at her. "About us, about the future, about what I want." "And what do you want?" She took a deep breath. "I want to marry you, Yates Sullivan. Not because I am under contract to you, but because I love you and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Yates felt his heart soar. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel rushed. I am sure. I have been sure for months, but I needed to get to a place where I could say it without fear. I am there now. I love you and I want to be your wife." Yates pulled her into his arms and kissed her, long and deep and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, he was grinning like a fool. "I do not have a ring yet, but I will get you the finest one I can afford. We can go into Virginia City next week and pick it out together." "I do not need a fancy ring," Grace said. "I just need you." They were married in June by Judge Harrison, with a few neighbors as witnesses. Grace wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Yates wore his best suit, the one he had brought from Missouri and had worn only twice since. It was a small ceremony, but it felt perfect. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and joy. Grace thrived as a full partner in the ranch, and together they expanded the herd and made improvements to the property. They built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms in anticipation of the family they hoped to have someday. Their wedding night had been tender and patient, Yates taking his time to make sure Grace felt safe and loved. She had been nervous at first, her past experiences coloring her expectations, but Yates was gentle and careful, and by the end, she was glowing with happiness. As summer turned to fall, Grace realized she was pregnant. They were both thrilled and terrified in equal measure. Yates immediately began fussing over her, trying to keep her from doing any heavy work, which Grace found both endearing and frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him when he tried to stop her from lifting a saddle. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I think I can handle feeding the horses." But Yates could not help himself. The thought of anything happening to Grace or the baby filled him with a fear he had never known before. He had lost so much in his life, and the idea of losing them was unbearable. Grace went into labor on a cold February morning. Yates had ridden to fetch the midwife from a neighboring ranch, and the woman arrived just in time to help deliver a healthy baby boy. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in Grace's arms, Yates felt tears running down his face. "We have a son," Grace said wonderingly, looking up at him with exhausted joy. "We have a son." They named him William Thomas Sullivan, and he was the light of their lives. Yates had never known he could love someone as much as he loved that tiny, red-faced baby. Grace was a natural mother, patient and loving, and watching her with their son filled Yates with a contentment he had never imagined possible. The years that followed were full of hard work and happiness. The ranch prospered, and they added more children to their family, 2 more boys and finally a daughter. Grace bloomed in motherhood, her earlier brokenness replaced by a deep joy and sense of purpose. She still wrote poetry, stealing moments when the children napped to fill her journals with verse. Yates often thought about the day he had seen Grace on the auction block, about the impulse that had led him to bid $500 he could not really afford for a woman he did not know. It was the best decision he had ever made, the one that had given him everything that mattered in his life. One evening, when the children were grown and beginning to make their own ways in the world, Yates and Grace sat on the porch watching the sunset, much as they had done all those years ago when Grace had first told him she loved him. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Grace asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "All the time," Yates admitted. "If I had not gone into town that day, if someone else had outbid me, if you had run away instead of trusting me." "I was not capable of trust then," Grace said. "I was barely capable of breathing. But you were patient with me, you gave me space to heal, and you loved me even when I could not love myself. That saved my life, Yates." "You saved mine too," he said, kissing the top of her head. "I was so lonely before you came. I had land and cattle and a house, but I did not have a home. You gave me that. You and our children, you made everything worthwhile." Grace lifted her head to look at him, and even now, decades after their first meeting, she could still take his breath away. "I love you, Yates Sullivan. I have loved you for so long that I cannot remember what it felt like not to love you. And I love you, Grace Sullivan. From the moment I saw you standing on that platform, I think some part of me knew that you were meant to be mine, and I was meant to be yours." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their oldest son, William, was running the day-to-day operations of the ranch now, though Yates and Grace still helped out when needed. They had grandchildren who visited regularly, filling the house with noise and laughter. It was a good life, a life built on love and hard work, and the decision one man had made to help a woman in desperate need. Grace had arrived at the ranch broken and hopeless, but with time and patience and Yates's steady love, she had healed. She had become not just whole again, but something more, something stronger than she had ever been before. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace squeezed Yates's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I could not see myself. For believing I was worth saving. For giving me a life worth living." "Always," Yates promised, the word carrying all the weight of the decades they had spent together and the love that had only deepened with time. "Always and forever." They sat together on the porch as night fell, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The ranch spread out before them, the land they had worked and loved and passed on to their children. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, witness to their love story, a tale that had begun with a broken woman on an auction block and a gentle cowboy who had seen past her pain to the person she could become. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the hardships they had endured or the obstacles they had overcome, but the love they had built together, brick by brick, day by day, until it was as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. It was a love that had healed wounds, created life, and proved that even in the harsh reality of the Wild West, tenderness and hope could flourish. As they rose to go inside for the night, Grace paused to look out at the valley one more time. "I belong here," she said with quiet certainty. "I finally belong somewhere." Yates wrapped his arm around her waist and smiled. "You have always belonged here, from the moment I brought you home. This has always been your place, and you have always been mine." They walked into the house together, closing the door on another day, another chapter in their long and happy life together. And if someone had told the woman on the auction block all those years ago that she would end up here, surrounded by love and family and purpose, she never would have believed it. But belief was not necessary. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to see your worth when you could not see it yourself, one person willing to wait while you healed, one person willing to love you through the darkness until you could find your way back to the light. Yates and Grace Sullivan had found their light together, and it had burned bright and steady for over 40 years. Their children carried their legacy forward, teaching their own children about the importance of compassion, patience, and seeing the value in every human being. The story of how their parents met became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. In the autumn of 1920, Grace Sullivan passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 72 years old and had lived a life beyond anything she could have imagined in those dark days before Yates Sullivan bid $500 for her freedom. Yates followed her 6 months later, unable or unwilling to be without the woman who had been his partner, his love, and his best friend for more than 4 decades. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they had built together. On Grace's headstone, beneath her name and dates, Yates had insisted on including a line from one of her poems, the first one she had written after coming to the ranch. "The mountains stand eternal, witness to my small life." But there was nothing small about Grace Harper Sullivan's life. She had survived when survival seemed impossible. She had healed when healing seemed beyond reach. She had loved and been loved, and she had built a legacy that would endure for generations. And none of it would have been possible without a gentle cowboy who saw a broken woman and decided she was worth saving. Their story became part of the history of Virginia City, Nevada, a reminder that even in the rough and tumble days of the Wild West, love could triumph over circumstance, and one person's compassion could change the course of another's life completely. The ranch still stood, now run by great-great-grandchildren who knew the story of their ancestors, and worked to honor their memory by treating all people with the dignity and respect that Yates and Grace had shown to each other. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets behind the mountains and paints the sky in shades of gold, people swear they can see 2 figures sitting on the porch of the old house, hand in hand, watching over the land they loved and the family they created. It is probably just a trick of the light, or maybe the wind in the cottonwoods, but the people of that valley like to think it is Yates and Grace, still together, still in love, still proving that the best stories are the ones that begin with hope and end with happily ever after. Their love story was not perfect, and their life together had known its share of hardship and sorrow, but it was real and true and built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. From the ashes of Grace's broken spirit, they had built a life of meaning and joy. And that, in the end, was the greatest triumph of all, proof that no matter how damaged we might be, no matter how hopeless things might seem, there is always the possibility of healing, always the chance for redemption, always the hope that someone will see us for who we truly are and love us anyway. The gentle cowboy and the woman with the broken spirit had found each other when they both needed it most, and together they had created something that would outlast them both, a love that would be remembered and celebrated long after they were gone. It was a story worth telling, a life worth living, and a love worth fighting for. And in the great tapestry of human experience in the vast history of the American West, their story stood as a testament to the power of compassion, the possibility of healing, and the transformative nature of love.